Howdy folks, Max Mogren reporting from beautiful Jackson Hole, Wyoming for the Sheepeater. It is 11:27 a.m. on Saturday, May 31st, 2014. This is a follow-up video to a very well-received video and article that I put out last week. JH News and Guide lies about climate change. Essentially, this video and article is calling out the local media for their inadequate and misleading coverage of the climate change issue, most notably the fact that humans have the technology to manipulate the climate, and these technologies seem to have been implemented already. Very well received, 25 shares on Facebook, 362 views on YouTube, and over 1,000 page views here on the Sheepeater blog. It made big enough waves that the local media actually picked it up. Here we are on Planet Jackson Hole, the Jackson Hole Weekly, and they put me, they gave me a little coverage in the Them on Us article that they do every week. They were kind enough to include my website address, but they do call me a chemtrail alarmist, and they call my ideas a conspiracy theory. The basic gist: Mogren contends a concerted effort is being made to manipulate the climate via chemtrails, cloud seeding, and other methods. Okay? Apparently, in the eyes of the Jackson Hole Weekly, this is a controversial opinion, and I'm going to prove them wrong. So here we are, North America. This is climateviewer.com. Every one of these little icons is an ongoing commercial weather modification program. There are over 50 going on right now in the United States. Here we see the Wyoming Weather Modification Pilot Program that's been happening from 2005 and is ongoing. The Upper Snake River Basin Project, the high Uintas. So all over the country, even up in Alaska, throughout Canada, these are just the operations taking place in the United States. Now globally, many countries are engaged in weather modification programs. This is the World Meteorological Organization's report from expert team on weather modification research for 2012-2013. Current catalog of countries active in weather modification activities. This list created identifies 42 countries with active weather modification projects. Okay, there are some big players here too, big countries: Argentina, Australia, Canada, China, France, Germany, Greece, India, Iran, Israel, Korea. Okay, all these countries, big countries. Mexico, another big country. The Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. So all over the world, 42 countries openly admit that they are engaged in weather modification programs. Notably, most of these programs, it's being conducted with the stated intent of precipitation enhancement, trying to make it rain more. As for the notion of chemical trails, here we see cloud seeding planes. This is just images, okay? There are planes emitting chemical trails with the stated intent of manipulating the weather. Here we see another example of a plane emitting a chemical trail, a crop duster. And in fact, all vehicles that use combustion engines emit chemical trails. Even your car does. Your car burns chemical fuel, it releases chemical exhaust. By definition, that is a chemical trail. Chemtrail is just an abbreviated term, and apparently, in the eyes of the mainstream media, anybody who believes in the existence of chemical trails is a conspiracy theorist, despite the fact that historically, chemical trails were used as a weapon to manipulate the weather. Here we see Operation Popeye, highly classified weather modification program during the Vietnam War, intended to increase rainfall and flood out the Viet Cong. They used planes emitting chemical trails. Also during the Vietnam War, Operation Ranch Hand, the U.S. military was using planes emitting chemical trails, in this case Agent Orange, with the stated intent of defoliating the forest. In reality, they killed a lot of people and plants and forests with these toxic chemicals, toxic chemical trails sprayed out of the back of airplanes. The history of weather modification is very fascinating. Here we are on climateviewer.com again. And all the way back in 1887, the Atlantic Monthly magazine was proposing using human technologies to reroute warm ocean currents to melt the polar ice caps. This article was about creating or building huge jetties into the ocean that would actually change the flow of the ocean's currents and cause warming. with the intent of making the climate in North America more moderate. Okay? Now, changing gears a little bit, last week the Planet Jackson Hole actually put out a really good article about the bee die-off, protecting bees from pesticides and other environmental stressors. And in here they made a good point. President Obama, blah, 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 giving money to target research to identify and address multifactorial stressors and their interaction. Okay, if we're going to take a serious look at the bee die-off, we obviously have to address all of the factors contributing, all of the factors stressing the bees. And it's strange how in the climate debate, the mainstream media only focuses on one of the factors, the CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions from humans. Now, I used to fall into that camp, and I was extremely skeptical of the notion that planes were manipulating our weather and climate until one day, a few years ago, I was out in California doing a little surfing, and I saw this. I saw this plane fly overhead, and it left this massive billowing trail with a real abrupt stop. I watched that plane trail as it dispersed, and it eventually started to form this weird, high, undulating wave cloud, cirrus cloud. There's the detail of the abrupt stop to that trail, and another detail, there's somebody on a nice wave, and there's the cloud after a few minutes. Okay? Obviously, that has an impact on our weather, and it was artificially induced. There's a more normal California skyscape. This is a picture from a friend in Italy. Okay, look at those trails. Real obvious plane trails forming a high haze. A picture recently taken in the Netherlands. Earth Matters Netherlands, 18,892 likes. Notice again the high trails and these cirrus clouds forming. NASA tells us that these high, thin cirrus clouds act in a way similar to clear air because they are highly transparent to shortwave radiation, but they readily absorb outgoing long wave. So the long story short, the sunlight gets through. You can pause it if you want to read this whole thing. The sunlight gets through, but the heat is trapped. The additional energy causes a warming of the surface and atmosphere. The overall effect of high, thin cirrus clouds is to enhance atmospheric greenhouse warming. So clouds like this, not clouds like that, that's natural. But clouds like this, they cause warming. Okay, this is confirmed. Nature, climate change, global radiative forcing from contrail cirrus, the abstract. Net radiative forcing due to contrail cirrus remains the largest single radiative forcing component associated with aviation. Our findings regarding global radiative forcing by contrail cirrus will allow their effects to be included in studies assessing the impacts of aviation on climate and appropriate mitigation options. Okay, ironically, decades ago, humans were already aware of this, and we were actually making steps. The technology was patented to stop contrail formation. Now, despite the fact that the technology exists, we see this all too often in the skies overhead. Obviously, this has some sort of impact on our weather and climate. And interestingly, all the way back in 2004, over 10 years ago, globe grows darker as sunshine diminishes 10 to 37%. Okay, defying expectation, hundreds of instruments around the world recorded a drop in sunshine reaching the surface of the Earth, as much as 10% from the late 1950s to the early 90s, or 2 to 3% a decade. In some regions like Asia, the United States, and Europe, the drop was even steeper. In Hong Kong, sunlight decreased 37%. Now, obviously, there are a lot of factors contributing to this global dimming, notably pollution from coal power plants and stuff like that. But these planes, this has a dimming impact too. You go outside on a day when the planes are leaving these lingering trails and these high cirrus clouds are forming, the sun is not quite as intense as it would be otherwise. So I would contend that these plane trails are actually contributing to the phenomenon of global dimming. You Google climate engineering, and over 39,000 recent news results, okay, a case against climate engineering. Strangely, the mainstream media always focuses on climate engineering like it's some future program that hasn't been implemented yet. But people all over the world are documenting evidence that it's already taking place, right? Geoengineering side effects could be potentially disastrous, research shows. Comparison of 5 proposed methods show they are ineffective, alter weather systems, and could not be safely stopped. Again, the mainstream media always floats the notion that we would only implement these programs to prevent catastrophic global warming, but in reality there are many motivations to manipulate the weather and climate. That is why 42 countries are currently openly admitting to engaging in weather modification programs. Here in the U.S., over 50 ongoing programs on a small scale, and I personally find it hard to believe that the U.S. military, the U.S. government as a whole, is not in on the game as well. What do we got here? This brings it more close to home. Okay, this is a canoe trip a couple years ago on Jackson Lake. Beautiful blue skies. Here come the plane trails. Oh, there goes the blue sky. Okay, that's Ranger Peak up by the lake. You can see the big X in the sky and the clouds forming. If you really watch, the planes come first, the trails are laid down, then those cirrus clouds form, not vice versa. Real abrupt start and stop on that one. There's that's the same thing, Ranger Peak, Mount Moran, big billowing spreading trails. Okay, that's a few minutes later as those trails spread out and form that haze. There we see a real abrupt line where beyond there it looks pretty natural, up here manipulated. Here, surfing the snake under chemical skies. This is down on the lunch counter rapid, and same thing. Planes fly overhead, leave these massive billowing trails. Notice the abrupt stop to this one. Right? Doesn't look too natural, does it? There's some more detail on the dispersion pattern, and there we see a guy surfing the snake in the sunset, and these plane trails billowing, spreading, forming a high cirrus cloud. So global dimming is a serious situation. Ironically, a lot of the mainstream coverage of global dimming, they'll say that the dimming is having a cooling impact on the weather, but NASA tells us that these high thin cirrus clouds have a warming impact, so we see a real contradiction there, and in my opinion a lot of this dimming is being caused by these plane trails. On the notion of global dimming, we all know that the most powerful natural disinfectant is sunlight, and right now we're in the middle of a mass extinction. A lot of these species that are going extinct, it's due to fungus. Okay, and historically fungus suspected in mass forest extinctions. Once again, less sunlight provides an environment that is more conducive to the growth of fungus. Fungus, climate change threatening big part of global coffee supply. Okay? Europe's salamanders at risk from mystery fungus. These are all new articles. This came out today. This came out last week. And here, the UC Berkeley fungi helped destroy forests during mass extinction 250 million years ago. They talk about a big volcanic eruption, a lot of volcanic activity blocking the sun, making it more conducive to the growth of fungus. Here in Wyoming and western Montana, throughout the Rocky Mountains, whitebark pine, an important producer of food for wildlife, is decreasing in abundance due to attacks by the white pine blister rust fungus epidemics of mountain pine beetles. Okay? If we've got global dimming, if we have artificial cloud cover, if we have 10% less sunlight reaching Earth's surface, we're going to have more fungus. Animals and plants all over the world are dying because of these fungal outbreaks. And it's important to note also that in the patents for these geoengineering technologies, aluminum is often listed as one of the most effective cloud condensation, cloud seeding nuclei. We all know aluminum is a very common element, but in Earth's crust, the aluminum is bonded to other chemical compounds and therefore is not biologically reactive. However, the aluminum that's being sprayed out of airplanes to manipulate the weather and climate they're very small particles. They're not deactivated by bonding to other substances, just water vapor. So it's important to note that plants suffer from aluminum toxicity. Aluminum that is biologically reactive is very bad for plants, especially in acidic soils like we have here in the high mountain environments where the white bark pine are dying off due to an epidemic of funguses and beetles. In my opinion, these trees could perhaps be more susceptible to the funguses and the beetles due to the presence of toxic aluminum in the rainwater. Perhaps the fact that the soil is very thin in the mountains, and a large percentage of the biomass is actually in the trees themselves, and most of the water they get doesn't come from groundwater but rather from precipitation. There is a lot of precipitation in the mountains as snow and rain. So perhaps these trees for a number of factors, these trees in the high alpine environment are suffering from this aluminum toxicity more than plants in other environments. Here we've got a recent TEDx talk. Simon Nicholson, a member of the Global Environmental Politics faculty at the School of International Service at American University. Now his talk, he talks about geoengineering like it's some future thing, but I think his closing statement here is worth paying attention to, so listen up.
I'm torn. You can see why this stuff is complicated. At the end of the day, if sea level rise in Bangladesh continues to become such a problem that lives and livelihoods are threatened, it could be that the most just form of response is to put a layer of sulfate particles into the air above the Arctic Circle to try and prevent ice melt. That could turn out to be the most just form of response. But at the moment, we're not talking about justice enough in this conversation. We're not getting to the ethical and justice and political considerations that need to be paid attention to. This is no longer an abstract scientific conversation. This has to more and more be a conversation in the realm of politics, ethics, governance, and equity, lest we be drawn down a path to a false solution. At the moment, lots of civil society organizations, large green groups, social justice and human rights groups don't want to talk about geoengineering for fear of giving it unwanted legitimacy, for fear that it will take us away from the other forms of response that they would like to see happen. But the message has to be, it's too late. We're beyond that now with this conversation about these technologies. The climate geoengineering genie is far too enticing and far too powerful to be stuffed now back into its bottle. We don't have that option anymore. Ignoring this conversation won't make it go away. So what we need are for concerned citizens, all of us, and civil society organizations who represent some of our interests to get more heavily involved in this conversation, to make sure that we move from, is this possible, to is this desirable? Should we be doing this? And if we move down this path, who benefits? Who controls it? So whose ends and in whose interests are these technologies being developed and potentially deployed? And my final message, my final line is a straightforward one. This is a meeting, this particular event, about the global future. If you care about the global human future, you need to start caring about climate geoengineering. Thank you.
That's a typical academic and environmentalist opinion on geoengineering. Unfortunately, academia, for whatever reason, still overlooks the fact that the weather was used as a weapon in the past, all the way back in the 1960s, that there are 42 countries openly admitting to these large-scale weather modification programs, that there are over 50 ongoing weather modification programs taking place in the United States and Canada alone, and Mexico. There's one in Mexico and one in Puerto Rico. And the U.S. government, the United States, is notably absent from this list of countries that are actively engaged in weather modification programs, which I find hard to believe because the U.S. government was doing that all the way back in the 60s. And all over the world, people are documenting evidence of these lingering, spreading trails forming high cirrus clouds, which NASA tells us have a greenhouse warming impact. And I would argue they're also contributing to the phenomenon of global dimming. Sunshine, the amount of sunshine reaching Earth's surface decreasing. I'm not alone in this theory. One notable person who's on the same page as me is Bill Xander Zalm, who is the former premier of the province of British Columbia. That's basically the equivalent to the governor of a U.S. state, except notably there aren't that many territories in Canada. Bill Xander Zalm was top dog in a very large and beautiful part of Canada. So he's not your typical conspiracy theorist. What does Bill say? The former BC premier received 47 pages of documents from the federal government. 6 pages were blank, and 10 pages had some portions blacked out. The retired politician said the papers prove that Canada is into geoengineering. There's no doubt about it, Vander Zalm told the Straight by phone. As to the extent of what they're spending and what they're doing, we don't know exactly. Okay, so there, Bill Vander Zalm, top dog from BC, retired, admitting this. Another guy, Ted Gunderson, who's a former FBI chief of the branch offices in Los Angeles, Houston, and I believe Atlanta. After he retired, he came out. Not surprisingly, Ted Gunderson passed away shortly after he started speaking publicly about his concern about chemtrails. Ted's opinion, and this is an opinion that shouldn't be ruled out given the fact that the U.S. military was spraying poison out of airplanes over Vietnam a long time ago, and the British before that. The notion that these could be sprayed for a number of reasons, not just to manipulate the weather. Ted Gunderson's opinion, this is genocide, this is poison, this is murder by the United Nations. This element within our society that is doing this must be stopped. And it does appear to be an international project, because here are people in Italy, people in the Netherlands, and you can go to these groups online. There are people all over the world documenting this. So it's interesting. Now, I think it's an important issue, and I'm sure anybody who's a real environmentalist thinks the same. So I invite the local media, the Jackson Hole Planet, the News and Guide, both, to have a substantive, informed public dialogue on this issue. And I would be happy to write you guys an article free of charge if you're willing to publish it. It's not going to be all conspiratorial. It's just going to go into the history, the facts, and the speculation that these programs which are proposed are already taking place. So there you have it, folks. See for yourself. Look up. One love. Peace.